Hey everyone, my name's Andy. I'm from Finding Value Finance. I'll be your host today. And we've got David Murrin with us. Murrin or Murrin?
It's
Hopefully I
Murrin,
pronounced
but
it.
all Americans call it
Murrin.
Murrin, to be fair. Try Murrin, it sounds better.
So thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. Taking the time to talk with me. Very and highly interested in your work. I saw you in another interview and you showed some stuff or described some stuff where 2000 was interconnected with what's potentially coming. And I was like, man, that's a big wave. I'm very interested. So thank you for coming on. Appreciate it.
And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for asking me.
So the first question I've got, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background, your experience with investing, to let everybody know kind of where you're coming from.
Well, I have a sort of weird, eclectic background because I was a physicist first of all, and then I became a seismologist and geophysicist. So I spent the first 3 years of my working life in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, which was pretty cool, and also an eye-opener because I very quickly saw how a group of people could share emotions, which was something I'd never really contemplated before, because we all thought that, we are individuals, there are emotions. And there they were in front of me, and one person's anger spread to another, and they were all angry simultaneously. Just happens to be they're angry at me. And you never forget that kind of palpable anger. But I've never seen it, even at the worst bar brawl I've ever witnessed. We'd never seen such anger. It was palpable. And then there was how to survive it, which in itself was a challenge. I chose to front it out. And then there was a discharge function where within a few hours, all these feelings ebbed away from this rather angry throng of 60 cannibalistic Papua New Guineans armed with bows and arrows who'd wanted to kill me. And 4 hours later, I was still alive. And they were like vacant school children. And I remember thinking, with a physicist's mind, it was like watching a capacitor, and the capacitor was the group, and it got charged by one person's emotions, and they all echoed that charge. And then with the time decay function, it disappeared. And I remember thinking rather arrogantly, wasn't it great to look back into our past because we're modern and we're different? And so I proceeded with that rather arrogant perspective until I came back and I ended up on the trading floor at JP Morgan by the bizarre sequence of events. And all I knew is I wanted to be somewhere where if I could be good at it, I'd be rewarded. And the city and an American bank especially was the only thing available around the time of the Big Bang in England that was really quite a constrained business environment. So I remember standing on this trading floor thinking, what do I know? So what do the economists know? Well, it's fairly apparent that they seem to make it look like they know, but they couldn't predict tomorrow or that a paper bag was coming with a hot dog in it the next day. It just wasn't going to happen. That fascinated me because we always laugh at sort of the gods of tribal cultures, but strange enough, sort of modern day economics, I think, has a similar piece or construct in many people's mind, despite the evidence to the contrary. And then I started to realize that everyone was getting very emotional. And what was interesting was this wasn't just modern man, this was the best of the pick of modern man that was basically getting extremely emotional. And in my own little mind, the idea was, we'd paid for a Cray computer and we got pocket calculators in terms of the way they took decisions. And that was when I realized that we were really not a lot different from Papua New Guineans. Our time decay functions were different. Probably the threshold of charge was different, but observation one, collective behavioral pattern afoot. So being a good physicist, I wanted to quantify that. And of course, I thought, well, price is obviously the trigger for emotional behavioral patterns. So I started to make my own price modeling. And after 6 months, someone tapped you on the shoulder because it was such a fundamentalist economic house and said, there's a lot of work being done out there on that topic. And that's when I started to look and realize that I was onto something, but someone else had been onto it long before me. And there was a groundswell of knowledge I wanted to examine. But before that, I decided to be profitable using these tools and defy a logic that, you earned money because you sat in the seat and there was a flow and you sat in the middle of the flow. I became fascinated by the idea of predicting something that you could extract alpha and money with just your mindset and your understanding. That was, 30, no, actually, I've got to say almost 40 years ago, 35 years ago. So I've been in the profession of investing as a principal investor since that period. And I was one of the first early successful prop traders. And then I left at 30, set up my first hedge fund, set up a second one, which was the bigger one in 3 years later. Managed that with a partner up until about 2012. Captured some of the most remarkable moves you could imagine. Things like top of '01 to the bottom of '03, #1 equity fund in the world, or the Argentine crisis, top to bottom. Remember the reality when Argentina was the bellwether of the emerging market world. I remember realizing there's something wrong because Brazil was moving up and it wasn't. So what would happen when Brazil stopped going up? Well, I concluded Argentina was going to implode, and we were selling bonds at 84, 83, 82, and saw something amazing happen, which actually threads through to a lesson that we'll talk about of what's coming. And that was institutional intervention that was really shit or bust type stuff, where the Argentines, the bonds had gone down to 50 and things were looking ropey. So the government mandated the pension funds buy their bonds. Of course, that created the next bounce. It didn't get up to 82, 83, where our entry point was. It got pretty close enough, like 75, and it pushed out the repo stack of all the shorts. And because we were first, we were the last to be pushed out. So we kept our shorts, and back it went to 50. We bought them back at 10 to 15. But this institutional resistance at the cusp of disaster, making it worse because they bankrupted the pension funds, is something that really I think we're seeing today in the US system, which we'll come on to. So we covered things like the Russian crisis. A little early on that, it really, really was unpleasant. Took us down to levels I can't ever imagine. We sat there for months with, principal bonds at 3, thinking the world had ended and our P&L was pretty crushed. But we stayed with it, and it moved up from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Ultimately, those bonds went to 120, and we've managed to average down to somewhere around 7. So it was hugely profitable and very unpleasant in terms of how long you have to wait for a recovery like that. Things like the 07, 08 decline predicted, we made about 84% in that period. Now, going back a little bit, it was a seminal moment, and that was after 9/11. I remember thinking, this isn't an accident. Just what if it's something else? What if it's a marker to decline? I mean, can you imagine thinking about American decline in '02? Impossible. But anyway, I was asking the question of myself, and I was thinking, and how would it be a marker? And my argument was the fracture of a system that until then had shared information between agencies, in terms of the FBI and the CIA, had become competitive, and competition meant there was a gulf and they didn't share, and that was the immune system breach that let 9/11 happen, which is exactly what did happen in retrospect. So then I asked the question of how could I see if America was moving into decline based on price? And the answer is there's not enough data that goes back far enough. But then I thought, well, what happens if America isn't just part of one system? What happens is it's part of a bigger system, a Western Christian system. So in fact, we're 500 years of Western Christianity, and America is the last of the Western Christian empires. How am I going to track that? And so I deconvoluted for what is a fractal in price based on an Elliott wave system to what I distilled as the 5 stages of empire, taking out the corrective waves because you don't see those in history, but you do see the impulsive surges in their character. So in effect, there are 3 surges up and 2 corrections down, creates 1 cycle. I called it the 5 stages of empire. I described a whole character that went with it, a whole concept behind it that basically would be the character, the shift between linear nature to lateral nature expansion, and then linear nature coming back and presiding over decline, lack of adaptation. And I sat down and thought, well, I better go and look at history. So as I proceeded to trundle through history, I was using wars as the clocks of empires. And wars are not just wars. There's a whole categorization which I produced in Breaking the Code of History, which shows the nature of conflict and the nature of wars being different. And sure enough, all of this, going back to the early Egyptians, these wars happened in the same place, same time, same innovations or not, and it was fascinating. And I realized then that, I described that wars are the clocks of empire. They really are. And this whole thing started to drop out where I could articulate 5 stages of empire: the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, then the British, Germany tried twice, then America, is the sequence of the Western Christian world. And we were coming to a decline and an end of it. And that was pretty, upsetting kind of concept. You can see the end of the civilization you live in, and that was back in '02. And then the other thing that happened, I thought, well, if you could apply that to the West, what happens if you look at the East? And I came up with the construct of the Super Asian Empire that started with Japan, And China was the second phase, starting with the Boxer Revolution in 1902. And it was in a well and truly mature phase to move into the vacuum created by American decline. And we were going to see a massive power swap. And at the same time, I was also have been a student of the Contraptive Cycle. And Contraptive was an economist in the Russian Soviet era, and he saw that there were these inflationary spikes roughly every 54, 56 years, and they corresponded to conflicts. And let's look at what he had seen. He'd seen the First World War conflict in 14. He'd seen the Crimea War. He'd seen Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars before, the American Civil War, which fitted in with the Crimea process, roughly. The two were, give or take a bit, sort of like secondary conflicts. And he went back further and saw these spikes. So his postulate was that inflation through input prices created conflict. And he tried to use that understanding to manage the economy. Didn't work so well for him. He ended up in the Gulag where he died. But he had noted and brought to the attention of this spike process. So at that stage, I knew that we'd start a new Contraptive cycle in about 2000. And all of our investment themes were about resources, commodities, when they were completely undervalued. And that played really well into our hands, for example, Russia. And if you think about how do we get to the stage where Putin is right now, we got to it because Putin came to power when the Contraptive cycle started. When he started in power, his only way forward, to his eyes, after years of failure to restart the economy, which was at the trough of the cycle in effect, he thought he had to be a member of the EU and he had to prostrate himself to the Westerners that had really treated Russia with contempt, I would argue. I mean, if we treated Japan or Germany with the same contempt we treated Russia, we would have ended not with allies, but just constant problems. But we didn't under MacArthur. We were actually very enlightened. That enlightenment didn't extend to Russia. And I think that was a fundamental problem, mainly because America needed an enemy of some kind, perhaps just to keep it sort of system positioned. But whatever it is, we missed an opportunity. But for Putin, as the commodity cycle built and moved upwards, and we were buying things like Lukoil at 60 cents, which I remember going on to the trading floors sometime years later, and there were people with it in their pension funds at $64. We sold it when we heard that 100 times later. But that was an example of Russia commodity cycle, Africa commodity cycle. So we used that actively to play it. We even built a private equity agricultural fund, the biggest in Africa at the time, with one of the great big endowments, and sold it in 2011 because it was the peak of the first surge. We'll come on to the second surge. So going back to my journey, I wrote a book as a result of my thought process, which was the investment thesis. It came out in 2009, but it was really written in 2003. So all the genesis of its predictions go back that far. And sadly, every single piece, from the reality of climate change to where the next great pandemic would come from, as in a Chinese weapons laboratory, to how wars would be fought. Most importantly, that we would be locked into a war with China somewhere around the peak of the next cycle from 22 onwards, and that World War III will have started around 22 onwards. And I would argue Ukraine is the start of that process, which will only get worse, into a spike, which is going to create huge friction. So that's the sort of journey how I got here. And then in between that, I decided to stop managing money around 2013 because I could just see so much money printing going on. I didn't want to be a trend follower. I wanted to use the time to live and do something else. But I did promise I would come back. And 2019, and in the summer, I could see we were coming to the end of the cycle. And so my first response was to set up another hedge fund and make lots of money when it all fell apart. But I had this really big seminal moment, the same thing that drove me to breaking the code of history, which is I felt like I've been given information to share. And I'm dyslexic, so the idea of writing a book, believe me, is like climbing 10 times Everest. It was the biggest achievement of overcoming. But it happened because my twins arrived, and I felt like I had an absolute compulsion to share the information I had because it was so important. So I drove myself through it, and then I was able actually to start to do more than I ever had with that intention. So in 2019 and a half, I realized I couldn't start a hedge fund because all the investors demand that you keep your USP to yourself. And this information had to be spread, but I needed a way to do it where I could prove how powerful it was so people would wake up and say, well, he's right about all these things, and that means the underlying theories have to be valuable. What else is he right about? And then have it cascade through our leadership to make a difference, hopefully to head us off of the path from the tunnel of conflict that we were going into. So Global Forecaster was born, a completely different concept, one that's based on the process of sharing information at different levels, whether it's a public with geopolitical views, which are very accessible, at not more than $50 a month, and their predictions are completely different from what you'll see in the everyday press because they apply our theories to outcomes. And there's a whole hedge fund embedded in the business that people pay for and to access, buy and sell signals based on our work. And then there's a special advisory part where the military actually, funnily enough, has taken the most interest, but corporations who don't have macro views, companies who fully invested in China would be the first to come along. And if they'd hired us 3 years ago, they wouldn't be about to lose everything, which they are now going to lose, because no one will get out of China intact as a result of a misunderstanding of exactly what China wasn't. It was never the opportunity people thought. It was a trap for Western capital. So that's a little bit of background. Since 19 and a half, the words gradually got out. You came to our door, and it's a great privilege to be sharing what I feel is knowledge which I've gleaned, but I think is systematic. So it's a construct as a physicist that I can share with you to then enable you to see the world in a different way and see it with more predictive eyes. And once you start to understand that, you can assume strategies or create them that get around the worst of the rapids. At the moment, we're just collectively blindly walking into a giant brick wall. In fact, we're not walking anymore. We're now running as a society.
So your approach, if I were to kind of sum it up, it's technical analysis based and herd mentality.
Yeah, look,
which describes some of it.
Yeah, look, I think I never really liked the word technical analysis. Right? I think what you're really looking at is the study of human behavior through price, which is a far more humanistic, what you're doing. Otherwise, I think a stochastic is an applied algorithm to a price pattern. You could call that technical analysis. But really what I'm into is behavioral pattern analysis of the collective, which is sort of subtly different because it has not only price, but it has consequences of perception. For example, how our central banks really think they've nailed inflation, don't understand input inflation's surges, not allowing for them. That's a fascinating psychology that constantly makes them the best reverse indicators in town. That's psychology as much as price pattern analysis. So I think technical analysis is quite limiting, and I tend to shy away from it, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. It does. Basically, technical analysis is the outcome of the herd, and you're in front of that. You're looking at human psychology, and that's exactly the leading indicator or the driver of it all. So I totally agree.
Exactly.
Totally agree.
And as a physicist, you always try and look at the most fundamental forces at play, not how those forces then leave their shadows on the wall, so to speak. So I think it's better to think of it this way. And what you're really trying to do is understand how human collectives operate and the point when they become completely blind. And a really good example, which I think is one of my current ongoing market predictions, which is everyone has thought that the yield curve was inverted because rates would stop rising because the central banks prospered this idea that they just crank up interest rates, inflation would stop, and the input price surge was just that, an anomaly. Wrong. Like, it couldn't be more wrong if you tried. But right now the yield curve was inverted, and now the yield curve is going to normalize because the energy price surge is the reality of another surge is unfolding, and the way they've evaluated inflation is completely incorrect. I mean, the triggers that trigger all of the latency of delayed price rises and wage spirals is the catalyst of input prices through energy, and we're now having another surge. And they'll be sitting and thinking, it's just within the range and it's not anything, but they don't understand it's the beginning of the next super surge. So we're going back. The parallels are 75, but think of 75 on steroids, and we can come on to that a bit.
Well, let's dive into it. Let's dive into your thoughts on commodities and this particular surge. What are your thoughts there? How are you seeing the commodity markets right now?
So Contraptive obviously recognized the spikes, but he didn't really recognize the detail of what was going on. So my first iteration of understanding was recognizing that I use wave counting, which I have to pay enormous respect to Elliot for. And I have to say there's some interesting questions that people don't ask, which is he presented a complete and complex evaluation of the fractal nature of price behavior in the 30s in one complete unit. I don't understand that. because ideas usually iterate. This complex, we should see a tail, actually a preceding tail of it was 4, and then I thought it was 5, and then I saw this fractal. Then there should be a whole evidence of something that essentially showed an evolution of thought. I show an evolution of thought in my 5 stages of empire model. I can clearly show where it originated from, how it evolved, and how it became more sophisticated, and hence its predictability indexes go up. We're just presented with this very complex system. And I do have to ask a question of, and I don't want to detract from Elliot himself, but I'd like to see the workings that led to it. And it leads to an answer is, where did it really come from? And that's one of the questions I often ask. Where did Gann's knowledge come from? And I suspect there is something about human behavior which goes farther back in our study of it than we can recognize. And a very good friend of mine dissected the Bible, for example, in Greek. And the numerology contained the most incredibly fascinating patterns from the neurology of the book. So I suspect that whatever it is we are doing is not unique to the last 100 years. Somehow there is knowledge from a far more sophisticated source that goes back than we give it credit for. And I say that because it's important to understand this isn't just sort of a random moment of someone sticking their hand up. It's something very fundamental. So what I started to do was look at Elliott constructs for how a K-wave would work. And in very big ranges, you basically see 3s up and 3s down, not 5s up and 3s down, which is the basic largest unit. Now that's interesting in itself. And I can only call upon wave-particle duality of light to suggest that there's a duality between some systems which are 5 and 3 to complete a unit, and some are 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, and they just go on forever sideways. Let's say the contractive cycle is a 3 and a 3. So from 2000, we had our first A wave surge into 2010. Then we had a decade of B wave. And I'd say the reason why the B wave was so deep and took so long was because underlying real growth in the Western world was so small compared to the leverage in the system that made it look stronger. So that's a super weak B wave, which then begat the printing of money on an epic scale. And now we're into the C wave as of the low of March 2020. And that C wave, as we talked with your chart, be a good time to show it, is going to be horrendous. Horrendous because essentially what it represents is a move into 25, 27, where commodity constriction is on a level we've not seen. And that, I think, is commensurate with conflict, because this C wave brings with it conflict, and the conflicts really escalate from the wave 3, which we're now in, and the escalation is Russia, but most likely China's involvement.
So I pulled up crude oil just to give an example of something. And this is the fractal that I grabbed and created, so I'll just put it on the side here. But this was your quote. You've got your 3 waves here. No, and that's your 3.
So that's your A wave, Andy. That's
yep,
the A wave
this is your
from 2000 to 2008.
This is your B.
Yeah.
And then you've got this wave that comes back.
Is
that your 3 of 3 that you were talking about?
No, that thing there is the B. So that you've got the A wave and you've got the B wave.
And then you've got C, which is your largest, biggest wave, right?
Which I think is.
And it goes.
And I couldn't have
it could go somewhere
myself,
and spike.
Except for I'd say it's much more compressed in price. So I'd probably have that spike in 26, 25. Move it really.
Well, you're saying it's compressed this way then, so
yeah,
it's more like
it's sandwiched up.
It's sandwiched up like this or something like that.
Yeah.
And why for the sandwiching?
We've had the 1, and at the end of the 1, obviously Putin felt bold enough to go to Ukraine. We've had the 2, and we are now in the 3. And that 3 is going to have a number of coils, as you can see. You've got those lots of squiggles here. So don't expect it to go straight to new highs above 131 and 120. Squiggles at coil energy below the highs and then break out.
I gotcha. So if we were to kind of zoom in on this, I know it's kind of smushed up, but perhaps we've got. So you're saying it might squiggle like this before 120 or something.
The more squiggling you get below the highs, where everything is up in 5s and down in 3s, it's like coiling energy that then releases.
Okay.
But that's
so you're thinking that, I mean, just from like a big picture view, that we've got a big A wave, a B wave pullback, and then we've got a monster move in commodities coming up just in general, based off of the Contractive wave.
Yep, absolutely. That's it. And now there's another way that so the first set of theories that I created were around the 5 stages of empire, polarization on the way to conflict, the wars weren't the same. So the theory of wars, the theory of spreads of diseases as systems went out into other worlds and gave them diseases, and some of them brought back. All those things were about the observation of our behavior. And it really started to bother me that I didn't really understand the energy that drove that behavior. As in, what is it that drove us to socially agglomerate, to build bigger social systems? And, we just assumed we did, but why? And I came up with a theory, and I based it around, and it was sort of a little bit like, the first observation was we always focus on really big disasters and stock market dips, but the thing recovers and then carries on up a bit. And so we can see the disaster that drove a price in an index down, but what we don't see is this, I call it like the hidden energy. And the hidden energy is a little old granny with her broom, keeping her house super tidy and ordering her house and her garden. And that human beings have this energy, all of us, which is anti-entropic. It actually orders the world around us. And we do it all the time, unless we live in a shit heap of a house. Then we're not doing it all the time. But if we keep a tidy house, we order our accounts and our affairs, we are actually ordering the world around us. And the reason why we came to create tribes was because collectively we could create more order, but the tribe had a higher quality of life, and individuals within it lived longer working together than not. But what we were doing is creating more anti-entropy. And then we went to empires, and we had problems with food because our grains in the field would be, rained out or hailed out, like you've been suffering from in Colorado. But then by the time you have the Roman Empire, your grain can come from Egypt, it can come from North Africa, it can come from Spain. So any one drought or rainy event, and the city still ate. So diversification, size, empires started to push back this process of the unknown. And if you look at the shift between polytheism, as in everything had a god because you asked him to make sure your grain was okay, or your water came regularly, or whatever else you needed to live, monotheism came about at the same stage as the Roman Empire had really solved an awful lot of the uncertainties of existence, thereby reaching a peak of collective anti-entropy. So it's this idea that the cycle to build empires is driven by the need to create anti-entropy, to create a bubble, to push back this randomness of the universe. And for those of you who don't know what entropy is, it's order going to disorder over time. So you all know that you're watching a film when I fumble my matchbox and it goes on the floor and the matches sprawl everywhere. But you know the film is going in reverse when the matches jump up off the floor into the matchbox and order themselves naturally. That's entropy at work. And what we're talking about is that process of human collective anti-entropy. So that is the nature of us. So the Contractive cycle that we measure with inflation or input prices is something more fundamental than that, in my opinion. Imagine that we've replaced the y-axis instead with an inflation rate or an input price, and we're going to replace it with a measure of anti-entropy. And as it gets to the top of the y-axis, there's lots of anti-entropy, or there's little, it's more entropic at the top, sorry, which means entropy is winning. And you get to the bottom of the cycle, it means order and anti-entropy are more dominant. And it's like a heartbeat in the human system. And it sort of beats every 56 years. And what happens is when we go through one of these spikes, it's a reshuffle. So it's forcing entropy into the system, which means when an empire is old and sequescent and basically could occupy the peak, but not be productive, not advance mankind at a really significant rate, a new system rises and the drumbeat of the Contractive cycle, which is entropy, then triggers this conflict. The conflict is the peak of entropy because war by nature is highly entropic, and the strong beats the weak by adaptation, lateralization, adaptation, productivity, and creativity. And then the old one is swept aside or subsumed, and a new one goes on to new peaks. And that's what we're seeing. That's human existence. So when people say we've solved wars, the only way we're ever going to solve wars and not do it again is we recognize why we do it. And no one understands why we do it and explains it in a way where it's part of our survival DNA. And it's actually worked quite well in many ways, because much as they're horrific and horrendous, even if you look at the First War, the percentage of the global population that basically died or suffered in the war, and the Second World War was about 3%, 7%, yet the whole world benefited from whole changes that ultimately brought about advances. The trouble is, as soon as wars become really destructive and start wiping out 50, 60, 70% of the human population, they're not doing that. And I think our weapon systems and our technology have now taken us to the point where we can't do it anymore, but we're about to. We're going to go one more time, and I think this time is going to be so bad that maybe third time we'll understand. And that was really the message I tried to talk about, is that these wars don't come about inevitably. They come about because weakness begets predatory behavior by another side that's expanding. And the best way to deter a predator is actually to put them at risk. But our societies have become so weak and lame. Even America, with its mighty armed forces, have really become weak and lame to the point where the predators have been encouraged to keep taking chunks out of the system. And until we turn that round, and I'm sorry, but bluster and political, bullshit are not substitutes for really clear military intent and political intent to ensure the boundaries of the empire are intact and to be preventive about the way we deal with them. And America has suffered greatly as a result of a period of leadership, which I would argue is far more self-enfranchised, serving self over the collective, which is the final hallmark of accelerated decline. Great leadership is actually serving the people you lead, not serving oneself. And I'm afraid you've had a number of those in your cycle. And so choosing and changing leadership is one of the things that happens. And it only really happens not in the process of being poorly led, but when the disaster is so obvious to everyone. And the horrible conclusion is America is speeding to a brick wall. And some people think it'll be civil war. Well, if America lived on its own without any external influences, there would be, because you are bifurcated and fractured. But long before that, your enemy will choose its moment, and you will all finally combine together to struggle to survive the onslaught that comes from China. And that's not far away.
I have a question here. You've got bonds, we've got yields just ripping to the upside. Is this part of the end of the 5 stages? Is the
absolutely
bond market and the yields going up?
Yeah.
Is that all part of it?
Yeah. Can you show me that bond chart we were looking at before there, Andy? Because it's a really good example.
I'll yank it up and we'll share it. So, and let me back out real quick.
Go as far back as you can, yeah.
This is all the data back in the 70s, 60s.
Yeah, okay.
That I have on this one.
So there is something truly weird about what has happened to rates that I can only describe as the manipulation of decline by the US Federal Reserve structure. So if you go back from sort of 63 up to the peak, go all the way up over here, you can see that the 10-year rates got to 15%, and CPI was at 15%, and Fed funds at 23%. That's the last peak of the Contractive Cycle some 56 years ago, and that's the minor peak where you get lesser wars, in which the case this was the Cold War with Vietnam, but not a war of hegemonic challenge, as I call it, that really put both sides completely at risk in the way that World War I did, or, for example, the Napoleonic Wars. So you can see that when we came down to 2000, and say, let's say 2003, yeah, down there, what should have happened is that rates should have based somewhere around 3%. And if the pattern had been replicated normally, we should have started to move up back towards, 7%. And the whole thing should have migrated this way. And somewhere now we'd be at 10%, and we'd be on our way to, back up to 15% highs in 25. Only I think probably we should be doubling them, because the whole breakdown of the empire's financial system is much worse. So this whole thing that happened between 2000 and 20 is truly anomalous, where somehow rates went lower when they should have been going higher. And I think what we're really seeing is the inclusion of China into the Western financial system and the reduction of inflation through low labor costs. And so what happened is this is the process that artificially kept rates down, and the couple with and allowed America to print money because China was included in and kept global inflation lower through cheaper manufacturing costs. Now, what's really interesting is if you've ever sort of seen how normal systems work, systems like this overextend, go the wrong way, and then they go the opposite way so badly. So at the moment, if you just go and compress it a bit more, Andy, so I think bonds are on their way. Where would they have been if let's go back a second. Don't know whether you can do this, Andy, but can you take this just for everyone? Go back to the early stages of the bonds. Yeah, okay. So take that stage there up to the peak in 75. Yeah, and then down to a low in 2003. Make it just do that same thing you did with the Elliott wave pattern. And then I want you to repeat
I can grab it.
Yeah, and I want you to anchor it in 2003. And then you go, yeah, that'll do.
Something like that right? is what you're thinking, right?
If we were in a normal domain, sort of, I think probably displace it to the left a bit, just so that, but we should be roughly at those levels. So yields should be at 10%, not at 4%, just as they return to their normalization process. But if I'm right about this K-wave cycle being at least twice the magnitude of the 75 cycle, then we're talking about, levels that are default levels. And I think that's really what we're seeing, is that the foundation is set for Western defaults on a scale we haven't imagined. I wouldn't put it from there. No, I think it's much more.
Is that what could come?
I mean, that's where it's, I think we'll end up at 30 somewhere. That's sort of what my mathematics suggests. But it's this idea that what should have happened is repeated over here, and in that repetition, you can see how we're completely in the wrong place. And if you look at the way bond curves are set up to be inverted, just if they properly normalize with a normal yield curve, there's an awful lot of bond, points to fall to the downside and yields to come to the upside. We've got a long way to catch up with where we should really be if the reality of money printing hadn't been with us. And then you come to the next thing is money printing has created added inflationary pressures. And we're coming up for proper global bifurcation with China. And, that constricts supply chains. What we've seen so far is just the beginning of the problem, because I expect to see China separated from the West just as Russia is, although it's very interesting because we're not really separated from Russia, even though we are effectively at war with Russia. And I've sort of find it very anomalous that we fund a war, quite rightly, to eject the invaders from Russia. And for those people in America that think it's not America's war, I would argue that's not quite reality, simply because America is an empire, whether you like it or not. Everything you have is founded on its global power. If your global power is threatened, then everything you have right now will implode even faster. And an example being Afghanistan. Afghanistan would have cost $5 billion a year to maintain a position of intention and strength, and not to signal that America under Biden was weak. The net product of that withdrawal is now you're spending an awful lot more in the battle against Ukraine, and an awful lot more you're going to be spending in surviving China. So these things start, and everyone thinks they're saving a bit of money, but man, that's penny wise, pound poor in a big way. And so what you face right now is the barbarians are at your gates. They're at all of our gates. But they are your gates too, even in the middle of Nebraska, in Colorado and the central part of America where you think you're safe, you're not safe. And only your size and a press which doesn't focus on foreign policy makes this argument that we shouldn't be spending the money on Ukraine because it's not our war. Well, I think Europe should be spending much more, by the way, and we should be mobilizing ourselves in a big way. We're not doing our bit, but it's everyone in the West's conflict. And for, relatively speaking, $50 billion over the course of this conflict, America's seen a degradation in the Russian army that's mind-blowing. So in terms of, using money to create an outcome, but the thing is, you need to prosecute that and finish it before they recover from the blow and come back, and you've got to do it again and again and again. So we're not being smart about that. In fact, I would argue that we are doing just about everything wrong to deter a major war. We're literally every single step where I hope we will become smarter, we become stupider. And it's my society, and that's why I created Global Forecaster to explain this to people. But basically, we're not going to get out of this. This isn't a struggle with autocracy where they're going to cozy up after the game's over and say, like a beer. They see the virus of freedom and democracy as the virus that has to be totally stamped out. That's the whole of our culture globally. And the Chinese Communist Party truly believe that's what they're going to do. They've created mechanisms to basically control the Uyghurs. And Uyghurs look at their phones, look at them, and they look at their haircut, their smiles, their shapes. And if they're not conforming, they're off to jail. They managed to take that same technology and look at the Hong Kong Chinese. And for those of you that are not familiar with them, 6 generations of capitalism turn them into the most energetic, freedom-loving, capable people you're ever going to find. 6 months, everything's dead because they use control programs on their population. And one of them is they remove key individuals who would stand up, they put them in prison, make them disappear, and the rest of people behave like sheep. They have understood that society is not equal, that some people lead and others follow. Take the leaders who would protest out, and everyone will eat their grass quietly. And our Western society faces extinction. It doesn't face strife. And the magnitude of that needs to be understood. And at the same time, the financial system that facilitated us is going to go through the worst shakes and traumas I can imagine. And I'm not quite sure how we do get through it, to be honest, because if you look at Britain, which entered the First World War in decline with an American challenger and a German challenger that were pretty powerful, and it just happened that America wasn't a global power at the time, but involvement in the First War gave it even more globalization. So it fulfilled its desires to be seen and heard. And I would argue that if there wasn't Germany, then sadly, Britain and America would have gone to war as a challenging hegemon versus the one in decline. But we were bankrupt by 1917. We had to come to America. And if it wasn't for the Zimmerman letter and the whole issue over Mexico, God knows what would happen. We might have even just been knocked out of the war, and Germany would have controlled Europe. And the same in 41, when Pearl Harbor, we were on our knees again. So what happens to America when there is no deep reserve? And now China doesn't have a deep reserve, but I'll put my money on their controlled financial system over a financial system that's fully globalized, that sees half the globe chopped out of its system and is just not equipped to be managed. So we have a big problem on our hands. Are the vulnerabilities financially that the Fed has been responsible for in along with politicians, and the money printing is something that, it's not the gay abandon of printing. And what they did was created the most sophisticated process that lasted for longer. And because it lasted for longer relatively, it's even more damaging. And I would argue that what money printing does is that societies have creativity and they become less productive. And at a critical time, production starts to look like growth drops. So some clever clock says, well, if we just leverage this 3 times, like we did in 03, look, those numbers look like America's growing again. That's great. And nothing happens. The lateral people are still creating, and the linear people. And then you get up to the bottom of the way, well, I think we have to do it 10 times. Will that work? So now we're 10 times leveraged. But then the linear people start to essentially make bigger political systems that are not dedicated to productivity. They're just dedicated to building a big political system, employing everyone with a hierarchy. So productivity drops off again. The next time you've got to stimulate it because now you're down to a fraction of your growth. So you've got 20 or 40 times. I would say right now, if you really stripped out American growth, minus 40 times the printed leverage, it's like 0.1 or 0.2. And if you've ever managed a portfolio that's leveraged, you look really good until suddenly that leverage is taken away from you and it goes opposite way very quickly. And I think that's the paradigm America is in. And because the leadership of America is predominantly under Biden, in the Fed, the banks, most of the large businesses, now very linear with declining productivity and creativity and lateralness, they cannot see the brick wall that we're charging towards. And sadly, they won't release power because they think they know all the answers. So it'll be a disaster. And it'll be a question if there's enough to be picked up, and for the lateral creative people to step in, which is always what happens to respond to entropy. Entropic events stimulate lateralism. Lateralism creates growth and adaptivity, and that surges the next phase of growth until it becomes stationary and the balance passes to linear consolidation, and then it goes to linear decline.
Here's a question. Could we get out? I mean, I'm just trying to piece this all together here. Is that why we're doing renewables? Are we trying to get away from oil and separate ourselves from Russia and all them? And can AI, artificial intelligence, increase the productivity of America to dig ourselves out of this debt or whatever we've got?
Okay.
Is there some ways that we could do this? Or
Andy, that's two massive questions. So let's just do one at a time, right? Great question. Great questions, though. So renewables, if you made the assumption that the spectre of World War III was never going to exist, mankind was in a new era, and much as China was going to rise, it would do it peacefully, because people like to say China's already been peaceful. I suggest you look at Chinese history pre-1975 and see how many wars the Communist Party initiated between themselves and their civil war, and after that. There is nothing peaceful about that organization. But if you want to walk around with a rose-colored spectacles and you look at the threat of climate change, I have been an advocate for 20 years that climate change is much worse than people realize. And my analysis was based, much as we base our analysis on price, having all sorts of variables embedded in it. Well, if you go and look at the Vladivostok ice curves of CO2 and temperature, every variable is in that ice core curve. And for anyone that looks at price patterns, you can pretty much see a self-regulatory system that goes back 800,000 years, that peaks and troughs. And so when it's at one extreme, the system restabilizes, sends it down to the bottom, and there's a massive range. You can also see there's a correlation between temperature and CO2. It might lag 100 years or 150 years, but ultimately temperature cools its arse all the way up to CO2 levels. And now you can see what's happened since industrialization. So back in 2000 and 2003 and 4, people were saying, no, it's just a blip. And as a geophysicist, I looked at the data, it really wasn't a blip. But the problem was that no one could build comprehensive models that took all the variables. So why would you do it? Just look at the ice cores and look at their behavior, because the answer's in the ice cores. And those ice cores suggest that we have built in 11-degree temperature change. And I think that is exactly where we are. And we are moving towards that convergence point, even as we admit more and push that point higher. The reason why it's taken time is because just like you get a nice big frying pan and you want to do some fry up, and you put it on factor 10, and you keep dabbing it, and it's cool, and suddenly it's hot. There's a specific heat capacity of the pan has absorbed the heat until a moment it hasn't, and suddenly you can see it's hot. That's what the oceans have been doing for us. But there have been hallmarks like average wave heights. And ever since we put satellites up to look at wave heights and random waves, we've seen wave heights increase, which means energy is going into the seas and oceans and increasing the thing you can observe, as have the energy of our weather systems. And it is rather ironic that America, as a major carbon emitter, is suffering so badly from the weather. And you guys really, it's costing you so much money just surviving in an environment like that. So you must be very aware of it. So if you don't think there's a war, there's a reason to change. And renewables do two things. They change the geopolitics of the world, taking it out of the Middle East, which for the West has always been an unstable partner. And although you could frack, your fracking was a product of cheap money. Sadly, you don't have cheap money anymore, so fracking and free capacity isn't there anymore. So that's not going to work. But what you could have is renewables, the sun, the wind, all of those things, lovely ideas. But the truth was we should just build masses of nuclear power plants, because they last forever, they're entirely safe. Small reactors by Rolls-Royce are the way to go. And if you'd even invested in thorium reactors, we could have made reactors we could have given the emerging market world and sold them without weaponization that follows. We haven't, mainly because the oil body didn't want it to happen, and there were enfranchised parties, and the politicians didn't have any vision, but we missed it. And one of the things that would have been really great if we'd got our socks together, imagine with this war with Ukraine, that the whole of Europe and the whole of America had gone to reactor-based power. Well, there would be no oil power, there would be no gas power, and there'd be no revenue for Putin to go and fund his ongoing war effort. So there were great reasons to do it, didn't think ahead, didn't think cleverly enough. But right now, you have to deal with the biggest problem that's coming towards us, and that's conflict before climate change. And one of the reasons why we have climate change is hegemonic challenge. America can't afford to change all its energy at once because it's a decaying old system that doesn't have the excess capital. And China can't afford to, although it's a rising system, because it's got to get to challenge America before its demographics fall off a cliff, which means it can only afford cheap energy. So climate change comes right back to hegemonic challenge. That's why I say resolve the hegemonic challenge issue, and then you can start to look at how the world pulls together. And one day we're going to have to, or we're just going to have to go to certain locations that are livable.
Yeah. And so how does one navigate these markets then with all this that's coming on? I mean, obviously we're kind of at the final stages. Perhaps there's a bond problem. You know, is this something where you take full safety in like physical metals or something? Or, you know, how does one navigate this?
I think the first thing is you've really got to do two things. You've got to take the rose-colored spectacles off, and whatever sense of paranoia you had, you've got to put that in the bin too. Because paranoia, unsubstantiated, doesn't help, right? You just have to look at the whole hard reality. We are going to see the financial system challenged in a way that makes the lows of 2008 look like a kindergarten party. And all of the things we took for granted, all of the securities we had, are all going to be challenged. Much as we watched the Ukrainians who one day woke up at peace, and since then their whole world has been turned upside down. And one of the reasons why we should take interest in Ukrainians' plight to help them out of it is because it's coming to us next in all sorts of forms. Financially, militarily, we are completely exposed right now. So we should be looking at them as buying us time, not thinking it's just an abstract existential conflict for America or Europe, or even though it's closer for Europe. And we haven't. We've been absolutely mind-blowingly stupid. At least in the Second World War, America was smart enough to become and build an armaments industry in the 2 years before it started in Europe to 41 that not only armed Britain, but it also provided the basis for the rearmament of America. And in truth, it provided the basis for the reindustrialization of America after the crash and the horrendous 30 deflationary period. Why aren't we doing that now? I mean, the idea that we should go and invest in factories in Ukraine as if it's just Ukraine's problem, are we mad? When you look at the armament race that China's initiated, look at the fact the whole of the fleets in anywhere in the Pacific Basin, US fleets are completely vulnerable to a strike with no warning, and there'll be nothing left after 20 minutes. No one talks about that. I wrote a book called Red Lightning that predicted the destruction of American power inside the second iron chain without warning in 30 minutes. And we live in that world, and yet most people don't realize it. It's like the era of battleships when someone else has carriers. People think they're battleships to do the trick, but they're completely vulnerable to carrier power. So we live in that paradigm too. So rose-colored glasses off, paranoia off, and I want you to believe in yourselves. Right? Because here's the great thing. We do have freedom, individuality, and we can think as much as possible as our brains let us be to be lateral and think ahead. That's the gift of freedom and democracy. So we've got to use it. We've got to have enough confidence that ultimately, and I do think this is how it will play out, is there are two ways human systems form. One is you build a system and you give the people in it freedom. So let's just say you give a rating for individual output, and their outputs are somewhere around 60, 70% because they're self-motivated, self-enfranchised, and highly productive. That's democracy and capitalism. And I believe that works. More people, more enabled, both intellectually in their activities and spiritually, than any other system in history. It has problems, it has corruption, it's not perfect, but collectively greater individual enablement. All you've got to do is go and look what it's like to be Chinese, and I guarantee you that most people are producing at 30 or 40% because they're completely crushed by the system and they're a little cog in a massive system. So ultimately, war is about adaptability, and the individuality that we have in the West versus autocracy will ultimately, especially with weapon systems which have become more powerful, and the dispersal of forces, because concentration of firepower forces you disperse, gives us an innate advantage as long as we survive the first onslaught where we will go from sleepwalking to being slopped on the floor to picking ourselves up. If we get through that phase, we will adapt. It might take a decade, and I think it probably will be a decade-long war, but we will get through this. The price will be horrendous because we have been blind, but we're going to get through it. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. However bad it is, we're going to make it. But what do you do in the meantime? First of all, you start screaming at politicians to get realistic. Doesn't matter which side of the party they are, whatever they are, face your position, mobilize your society, start to serve your country, as in collectively. And freedom comes by talking to your friends, by talking about it, by spreading the word. And that's the amazing thing about human social organisms. Our strength was I developed a spear thrower and I'm a Neanderthal. So now I'm a very strong Neanderthal with a spear thrower, and I know I can kill anything at long distance. But we don't talk to other tribes. So my luck, our prosperity in our tribe means that my tribe swells a bit, but the Neanderthal tribes on the whole don't know about it. Humans, on the contrary, one guy got lucky with a spear thrower, everyone got to hear a spear thrower. Now, you know, Homo sapiens sapiens can take on a Neanderthal, and they can take on anything else. So that is our gift. Our gift is communication of ideas, knowledge, innovation, and we have to use it. So talking about the threat, understanding the terrain, that's what the use is, and that's what Global Forecaster is dedicated to. And the next thing is what you do with your finances so you don't get washed down the Swanee. Well, the one thing you don't want to be is being an equity index. Tick that off the list. You don't want to be a bond index. Tick that off the list. So what are you left with? You live with real assets. Well, you live with energy assets, we talked about. Although somewhere along the line, you must expect energy companies to be nationalized. You know, so the ride won't go all the way up the curve because the states, something will happen. It always does. And gold and silver is still, I think, one of the best bellwethers because the dollar is basically going to really suffer in this process because it doesn't take the whole world to protect the dollar. It just takes a few percentages of your trade balances to no longer be in dollars, but in another currency. And because you're an old empire, it's just those marginal changes of dollarization and use of dollars that can have a huge impact on how the whole system operates. So you don't want to be, you want to be in other currencies. And, you know, my preference for other currencies are the Swissies, always good. Strangely enough, I think sterling is a pretty good safe haven because we're not a dead moribund system like the EU, past its sell-by date. We're not a declining empire, sadly. And I do love America, by the way, so I don't say this in relish. And we're not Japan sitting right next to China is about to jump on me. You know, so that's a great safe haven. Go back to sterling for a time. I can see it busting at the seams with just these large blocks trying to get in. And ultimately, petrocurrencies probably will be pretty good. When the Norwegian krona stops being intervened by its central banks, it will correct to the reality of the fact that they're an incredibly wealthy country. And they benefit enormously from Finland and Scandinavia now being the front line against Russia. So basically, their security factor has gone up too. So there's lots of pluses there. So I think that's the reality. You prepare yourself, and we've had a very, very privileged span of life in the span of history and humanity. And sadly, our children are least equipped for hardship unless we've, you know, been mindful of what's coming. And equipping our children and being prepared, as Ukrainian children have found out. I mean, they grew up, they came out of the Cold War in the 90s, they thought the world was their oyster, and those poor kids are now on the front line being extinguished at a rate that is absolutely hideous. I mean, I can't get my head around, you know, what are we talking about? 550,000 young men and a few, you know, and some women involved. Don't mean that in a diminishing way, but at the moment combat is male orientated on both sides. Many of those Russians didn't want to fight. They're the casualties of Stalingrad. This is not minor. This is huge. So carrying on and imagining it isn't, I think is all to do with taking the rose-colored glasses off. So getting realistic. And the other thing too is, I'm going to say this, it sounds funny because most people are now going to be frozen saying, oh my God, does he mean it? Yes, I do. But the other thing is our ancestors got here by living through much worse on the individual basis of the settlers in the States, the Indians, the way they had to get. I mean, we are a very tough race. We got here because we're tough. Now, we're having to make it tough for ourselves, but we have all those resources in us. And having been blind and munched the grass for too long, we're now going to have to find it and call it. And it will make society, once we're through this, deeply traumatized, but it will ultimately start the production cycle again, as it always has.
I don't know if you follow this, you know, cryptocurrencies. Is that another thing that would be viable, or
anything that's tradable, anything that moves, I have an interest in, Andy. Yeah, look, Cryptos are really interesting in that they've come about in a period of hegemonic collapse of the dollar. I don't think that's an accident, because at this stage, if it was acorns, coated in silver, there would be silver acorns doing the same thing. I think that the blockchain protocols can be broken ultimately by quantum computers. There's more than 15 quantum computers around, and someone will work out how to do it, and watch out for that. But within the constraints of blockchain is still not, vulnerable to those type of attacks. It represents a safe haven, and I can easily see. I mean, crypto patents are a thing of beauty. They don't have any professional bodies. Dare I say it, the general public conform to the most unconscious collective behavioral patterns, and the quality of patterns are beautiful. Things like Bitcoin have been, possible for us to pick every single move from the surge up to the drop, the next rally to the drop. We've had a major low, sub sort of 17, and I think we're on the way to some very big numbers, mainly because it represents a safe haven in a time when people wonder what to do with it. And of course, it's mobile. So as long as blockchain's intact, it'll be a good place.
Okay, well, I don't have any other questions for you, David. You really covered a lot here. How do people reach out to follow your work? How do they follow you? And I'll put it in the description link below too. So how do they follow you?
So if you go to the site davidmurrin.co.uk, murrin.co.uk, or Global Forecast, it goes the same way. There you're going to see everything on offer. You're going to see all of our theories in the public domain. I recommend you read not only the market theories, but you read the big picture theories, because you need the context to see how it's all coming in one piece. So make that a study. Then you can sign up to Murrinations as a member of the public. That allows you to see our predictions on wars. I mean, for example, we warned the pandemic was coming in November, before most people knew it was coming in March. Every client of mine knew what was happening in Wuhan. And the war with Russia, we warned 5 to 6 months beforehand that it was inevitable. And we're warning that the war with China is inevitable too. So it isn't just we fell out of bed on the right or the left. Everything we talk about has a social science, or what I call the physics of humanity, locked up in its predictions, and we always explain them. So you get real-time predictions. We did put a market thing out that the bear is back, which we don't often do to the Murrination portion, because we can't give recommendations in the public domain. But then there's another portion for people who are professional investors. It goes to absolutely the best hedge funds and CIOs in the world. And it has a piece which talks about how the macro world is unfolding, where we see moves, the geopolitics that draws into that process. And then it has a whole trade execution element, which hedge funds buy, which is buys or sells. And if you are professional enough, then you can access that if you qualify as a professional investor. And then beyond that, people ask us to come along and give advisory packages for boards or large groups, or even solve problems. Because one of the things that's interesting is that organizations no longer on their board have people who understand the macro world. They're much more about the details. And the result is they're looking after the details, and there's a large tidal wave coming down, i.e. rates are going up, and they've got loans that they need to refinance. Well, if we've been sitting on a board or advising that board, the company would be secure, would have refinanced 2 years ago. It wouldn't be a tidal wave they've got to worry about. But if you look at the Russell 2000, it's very clear there's some 2,000 companies that are highly exposed to refinancing, which is why the Russell is literally leading the way down. And the technology companies, which operate slightly differently, seem to be immune, but they won't be for long, because they'll have their own problems linked to this. So you can go to the site, there's contact points. Then there obviously, if you join up with the site, then you'll hear other podcasts or interviews as they come out live. And it's a pretty complete package. The following's grown. It's right the way across the Anglosphere. And we welcome anyone who thinks laterally and would like to be ahead of the curve. And that's what Global Forecast is about.
Awesome, David. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you, Andy. It's been a real privilege to be interviewed by you.